Gideon Flint had tested hundreds of strangers who knocked on his door over the years. Each time, he'd pretend to sleep and listen. Each time, they revealed their true intentions within an hour. It was a simple rule that had kept him alive on this isolated homestead. Trust no one until you hear what they say when they think you can't hear them. But tonight, something felt different. The two Apache sisters who'd arrived at sunset, claiming to need shelter from the approaching storm, had been whispering for 3 hours straight. 3 hours no one had ever whispered that long before. Gideon lay perfectly still on his wooden cot, controlling his breathing, listening through the thin cabin wall. The older sister's voice was barely audible, but her words were careful, deliberate. The younger one responded in short, urgent phrases. They weren't speaking English. They weren't speaking any dialect he recognized, but somehow, impossibly, he understood every word. That should have been his first warning, that this night would shatter everything he believed about his past. The older sister said something that made his blood turn to ice. She had mentioned a name that no living person should know. A name buried with the ashes of his former life 15 years ago. But when the younger sister responded, Gideon realized with growing horror that they weren't just talking about his past. They were talking about something he'd done, something he'd convinced himself had been forgotten by the world. And as their whispered conversation continued, one terrible truth became clear. These weren't strangers seeking shelter. They had come here specifically for him. The storm had been building all afternoon, but Gideon Flint knew storms. He could read them in the weight of the air, the way his cattle huddled near the eastern fence, the color of the clouds rolling across the prairie. This one would last through the night. When the two Apache women appeared at his door just as the first drops began to fall, something in his chest tightened. The older one stood tall despite the exhaustion in her dark eyes, while the younger sister leaned heavily against the porch post, favoring her left leg. Both wore travel-worn dresses that had seen better days, and their long black hair hung loose around their shoulders. "Please," the older woman said, her English careful but clear. "My sister needs shelter just for the night." Gideon's hand remained on the door frame, blocking their entry. In 15 years on this homestead, he'd learned to trust his instincts. Something about these two felt different, too deliberate, too convenient. "There's a town 12 miles south," he said, watching their reactions carefully. "They've got a proper inn." The younger sister looked up then, and Gideon saw something that made him pause. Pain, yes, but also a flicker of recognition in her eyes, as if she'd seen him before. That was impossible. He would have remembered the storm, the older woman pressed. "We cannot travel in this weather. My sister was injured yesterday." "Please," lightning split the sky behind them, and the rain began in earnest. Gideon's practical side, weared with years of horror, durned caution. But when he looked at the younger sister again, something in her expression reminded him of someone he'd tried very hard to forget. Against his better judgment, he stepped aside. "You can sleep by the fire," he said, gesturing toward the small common room. "But I rise before dawn. You'll need to be gone by then." "Of course," the older woman replied, but there was something in her tone that suggested she had no intention of leaving so soon. As they settled near the fireplace, Gideon retreated to his cot in the back room, separated from them by only a thin wooden wall. He lay down fully clothed, keeping his boots on. This was his test. In an hour, maybe two, they would reveal their true purpose. They always did. But as he closed his eyes and slowed his breathing to mimic sleep, Gideon couldn't shake the feeling that tonight he might be the one being tested. The younger sister whispered something in Apache, and her words hit him like a physical blow, because somehow impossibly he understood every word. "Sister," she had said, "we found him." Gideon's heart hammered against his ribs, but he forced himself to remain perfectly still. The Apache words came flooding back to him now, pulled from a part of his memory he'd sealed shut 15 years ago. He'd spent 3 years living among the Apache after his family died, learning their language, their ways, their customs, before everything went wrong, before he became someone else entirely. The older sister responded in low, urgent tones, "Ayanna, be quiet. If he understands our words, he's asleep, Ka. Look at his breathing." But Gideon wasn't asleep. Every muscle in his body was coiled tight, as he listened to them discuss him in the language he'd once spoken fluently, the language he'd sworn never to use again. 15 winters have passed, Ayanna continued. He looks older, harder. The scar is still there, Kaya whispered. Above his left eye, it's him. Gideon's hand instinctively moved toward the thin white line that cut through his eyebrow, a reminder of the day his old life ended. Very few people knew about that scar. Even fewer were still alive who'd seen how he got it. What if he doesn't remember us? Ka asked. He remembers, Ayanna replied with certainty. The question is whether he'll listen. And if he refuses, then we take what we came for and leave. But sister, if what grandmother told us is true, if he really was the one who her voice dropped so low that Gideon had to strain to hear, if he was the one who saved our brother that day, then he deserves to know the truth about what happened after. Gideon's breath caught in his throat. Their brother, he remembered now, a young Apache boy, maybe 8 years old, caught in a flash flood. Gideon had pulled him from the rushing water, carried him to safety. But that was years before he left the Apache lands, years before the incident that forced him to disappear. The truth will destroy him, Kaya said softly. Perhaps, but the lie has already destroyed someone else. The sisters fell silent then, and Gideon found himself trapped between desperate curiosity and growing dread. What truth, what lie, and why had they tracked him down after all these years? Thunder rolled across the prairie, and rain droomed harder against the cabin roof. In the sudden quiet between them, Gideon heard something that chilled him to the bone. One of the sisters was crying. But it wasn't tears of sadness. It was the sound of someone who'd been carrying a terrible burden for far too long. Someone who'd finally found the person who might be able to help them set it down. Tomorrow, Ayanna whispered, when the storm ends, we tell him everything. What if he runs? Then we follow him. We've waited too long for this. Our brother deserves justice, even if it comes 15 years too late. The word justice hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Gideon lay frozen on his cot, his mind racing backward through 15 years of carefully buried memories. Their brother, the boy from the flood. But what did justice have to do with a rescue? Unless I still see his face in my dreams, Kaya whispered, and her voice was thick with old grief. Little Takakota, so proud when he learned to track deer with the older boys, so excited to prove himself. Takakota, the name hit Gideon like a fist to the stomach. He remembered now, not just the rescue, but what came after the boy who'd grown into a young man. The young man who'd been there that terrible day when everything went wrong. Tell me again what the traitor said. Ayanna murmured that there was a witness. Someone who saw what really happened at the canyon. Someone who could prove that Takakota didn't start the fight that got him killed. Gideon's throat constricted, the canyon, the fight. The day that had haunted his nightmares for 15 years. The day he'd been forced to choose between staying to tell the truth and running to save his own life. The traitor said, this man, this Gideon Flint was there when our brother died. That he knows who really fired the first shot. But why didn't he come forward? Why didn't he speak for Takakota when the soldiers came asking questions? Maybe he was afraid. Maybe he thought no one would believe him. Or maybe Kaya's voice turned hard. He was the one who killed our brother. The accusation struck Gideon like lightning. They thought he was the killer, They'd tracked him down because they believed he'd murdered Takakota. The irony was suffocating. They wanted justice for their brother's death, but they'd found the one man who tried desperately to prevent it. "We have to be careful," Ayanna warned. "If he is guilty, if he knows we suspect him, then why would he let us stay? Why give us shelter? Perhaps he feels guilty, or perhaps he wants to know what we know before he decides what to do with us." Gideon's hands clenched into fists beneath his blanket. The terrible weight of that day came flooding back. The argument between Takakota and the group of drifters, the insults that escalated into threats, the moment when Gideon saw one of the drifters reach for his gun. He'd shouted a warning, but it came too late. By the time the smoke cleared, young Takakota lay bleeding in the dirt, and the drifters were claiming self-defense. But only Gideon had seen the truth. Only he knew that Takakota never drew his weapon. "Tomorrow, we ask him directly," Ayanna decided. "We tell him we know he was there. We demand the truth, and if he lies, then we make him understand that some debts must be paid." No matter how much time has passed, the sisters fell quiet, but Gideon could hear them moving about, preparing for sleep. His mind churned with the weight of what he'd learned. They weren't here to thank him for saving their brother as a boy. They were here because they thought he'd killed that same brother as a man. The storm was beginning to weaken. But inside the cabin, a different kind of tempest was building. And tomorrow, when the truth finally came out, Gideon wasn't sure any of them would survive it. Sleep was impossible. Gideon lay listening to the gradual quieting of the storm and the soft breathing of the two women in the next room. Every detail of that day 15 years ago played in his mind with cruel clarity. He'd been trading horses with a group of Apache families when the trouble started. Takakota, now 19 and eager to prove himself as a warrior, had ridden into their camp with news that a group of drifters was stealing cattle from Apache lands. The boy had wanted to confront them alone, but Gideon had insisted on coming along. They'd found the drifters at Silver Canyon, 5 rough men driving a small herd of stolen cattle. What should have been a simple confrontation had turned ugly fast. The leader, a scarred man named Dutch Morrison, had laughed when Takakota demanded they return the animals. "Indian boy thinks he can tell white men what to do," Morrison had sneered. Takakota's hand had moved to his knife, but he hadn't drawn it. Gideon remembered that clearly. The young man had kept his weapons sheathed, trying to solve the problem with words first, just as his grandfather had taught him. But Morrison and his men had no interest in words. Gideon had seen Morrison's hand inch toward his pistol, and had opened his mouth to shout a warning. In that split second before the gunshot rang out, their eyes had met. Morrison had smiled, and Gideon knew the man was about to commit murder. The shot came fast, too fast for Takakota to react. The young Apache fell without ever drawing a weapon. When the soldiers arrived to investigate, Morrison claimed self-defense, said the savage had attacked them first, that they'd fired to protect themselves. The other drifters backed his story. 5 white men against 1 Apache witness, who wasn't even family. The investigation barely lasted an hour, but there had been another witness. Gideon had seen everything from behind a rock outcropping where he'd been watching the cattle. Morrison knew he was there. After the soldiers left, the drifter had found him. "You seem like a smart man," Morrison had said, his gun still smoking in his hand. Smart enough to know that sometimes the truth ain't worth dying for. The threat was clear. Stay silent or join Takakota in the ground. Gideon had made his choice. He'd taken Morrison's money, left Apache lands that very night, and never spoken Takakota's name again. For 15 years, he'd told himself he'd had no choice. 5 armed men against 1. He would have died for nothing. But lying here now, listening to the quiet grief of Takakota's sisters, Gideon finally understood the true cost of his cowardice. Outside, the storm was breaking apart, but inside his chest, a different kind of weather was building. The sisters wanted justice for their brother. They deserved the truth, but the truth wouldn't just destroy Morrison. It would destroy Gideon, too, because there was one detail he'd never told anyone, one secret that made his silence even more damning. Morrison hadn't just threatened him. The drifter had offered him a partnership, a cut of every herd they stole, every job they pulled, easy money for keeping quiet about what he'd seen. And in his fear and desperation, Gideon had said yes. As dawn approached and he heard the sisters beginning to stir, Gideon realized his test had failed completely. He'd learned their plan, but in doing so, he'd discovered something far worse. The man they'd come to find wasn't just a coward who'd watched their brother die. He was an accomplice to murder. Dawn crept through the small window, painting the cabin walls in shades of gray. Gideon heard the sisters moving about quietly, whispering as they prepared for what they clearly believed would be a confrontation. He could no longer bear the weight of pretending to sleep. Slowly, he sat up on his cot and faced the truth he'd been running from for 15 years. "I know you're awake," came Ayana's voice from the next room, steady and sure. "We heard your breathing change an hour ago." Gideon's blood went cold. They'd known he was listening. The entire conversation had been deliberate, designed to test him, just as he tried to test them. The hunters had become the hunted. He stood and walked into the main room where both sisters waited by the dying fire. In the pale morning light, he could see their father's features in their high cheekbones, their grandmother's wisdom in their dark eyes. These weren't the frightened travelers they'd pretended to be. These were warriors on a mission. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "That you were listening. Since the moment you lay down," Kaya replied. "Men who truly sleep don't hold their breath when thunder strikes." "That's not what I meant. We know." Ayana stepped forward, and Gideon saw her hand rest near the knife at her belt. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" For a long moment, the three of them stared at each other across the small room. Outside, morning birds were beginning to sing, but inside the cabin, the air felt heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. "I didn't kill your brother," Gideon said finally, "but you know who did." Ka accused. "Yes, and you said nothing. For 15 years, you let his killer walk free." Gideon's hands trembled as the full scope of his guilt settled on him like a physical weight. "It wasn't that simple. It was exactly that simple." Ayana's voice cut like a blade. "A man murdered our brother in cold blood. You watched it happen. You chose to stay silent. I chose to stay alive. You chose money over justice." The words hit him like a physical blow. They knew about Morrison's payment. Somehow they knew everything. How he whispered, "Dutch Morrison got drunk in a trading post 3 years ago." Ka said, her voice bitter with old pain. Started bragging about how he'd bought himself a witness to murder, how some coward named Gideon Flint took his silver in exchange for letting him walk free after killing an Apache. The room spun around Gideon. Morrison was still alive, still telling the story, still destroying lives with his poison. And now these women knew the full extent of his betrayal. "Where is he?" Ayana demanded. "I don't know. I never saw him again after that day. Liar, I swear to you, you took money from our brother's killer." Kaya interrupted, stepping closer. "Blood money. You became his partner in murder the moment you accepted his payment." Gideon wanted to deny it, wanted to explain the fear and desperation that had driven his choice. But looking into their faces, seeing the pain he'd helped cause, he found he had no words left for excuses. "What do you want from me?" he asked instead. The sisters exchanged a look, and Gideon saw something in their eyes that made his stomach drop. "We want you to help us find him," Ayanna said quietly, "and then we want you to watch him die." Gideon stared at the two women, his mind reeling from their demand. Help them find Morrison, watch him die. After 15 years of running from his past, they wanted him to run straight toward it. "You're asking me to help you commit murder. We're asking you to help us deliver justice," Ayanna corrected. "There's a difference, not in the eyes of the law. The law had its chance 15 years ago," Kaya said bitterly. "The law chose to believe 5 white men over the truth. The law failed our brother." Gideon understood their anger, felt it burning in his own chest. But what they were proposing would make them no better than Morrison himself. "And if I refuse, then you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder," Ayanna said simply. "Because we'll tell everyone who you really are. Every town, every territory, the man who took blood money to cover up murder." The threat was clear. His carefully built new life would crumble within months. No one would trade with him, sell to him, or offer him work. He'd become a pariah, forced to keep running until he died alone and forgotten. "How did you find me?" he asked, stalling for time to think. "It took 3 years," Kaya admitted. "We followed Morrison's trail from trading post to saloon, listening to his drunken stories. He mentioned your name often, always laughing about his business partner who helped him get away with murder. I wasn't his partner. You took his money. You kept his secret. You let him profit from our brother's death." Ayanna's voice was cold as winter wind. "What would you call it?" The words hit home because they were true. For 15 years, Gideon had told himself he'd been a victim of circumstance, that he'd had no choice. But sitting here now, facing the consequences of his cowardice, he couldn't maintain the lie any longer. "Morrison spoke about you like you were friends," Ka continued, "said you'd been reliable. Kept your word. Said he knew where to find you if he ever needed a favor." A chill ran down Gideon's spine. "He knows where I am. For years, apparently, he's been keeping track of you, making sure his investment stayed quiet." The implications crashed over Gideon like a wave. Morrison had been watching him, monitoring his life, ready to eliminate him if he ever became a threat. All these years, Gideon had thought he was hiding, but he'd really been a prisoner. "There's something else," Ayanna said, and her voice carried a note that made Gideon's stomach clench. "Morrison isn't just a cattle thief anymore. He's built himself a small empire. Dozens of men work for him now, stealing livestock, robbing supply wagons, murdering anyone who gets in their way." "How many people has he killed since Takakota?" Kaya asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke. How many deaths was Gideon responsible for? How many families had Morrison destroyed while living free because of his silence? We tracked down some of the other drifters who were there that day. Ayanna continued. 2 of them are dead. 1 disappeared, but the 4th one, he told us something interesting before we convinced him to talk. What Morrison has been planning something big, a robbery that will set him up for life, and he wants his old partner to help him pull it off. Gideon felt the blood drain from his face. "What are you talking about?" "He's coming here, Gideon, tomorrow, maybe the day after. He's coming to collect his business partner for one final job." The room seemed to tilt around him. Morrison here. After 15 years of carefully maintained distance, the killer was coming to drag him back into the darkness. "That's why we had to find you first," Ka said softly. "Because when Morrison arrives, you're going to have to choose." "Choose what?" "Whether you die as his partner," Ayanna said, "or live as our ally." The sound of approaching horses reached them before noon. 3 riders moving at an unhurried pace across the prairie toward Gideon's homestead. Through the window, he could see them clearly. Dutch Morrison in the lead, flanked by 2 younger men with the hard eyes of professional killers. "Get in the back room," Gideon told the sisters urgently. "Stay quiet no matter what you hear." "No," Ayanna said firmly. We've waited 15 years for this moment. This isn't how it should happen. Not like this." "Then how?" Ka demanded. "When Morrison rides away from here, how many more people will die because we let him go?" Before Gideon could answer, Morrison's voice boomed across the yard. "Gideon Flint, get yourself out here, partner. We've got business to discuss." The word partner hit Gideon like a physical blow. Even after all these years, Morrison still considered him an ally, still expected his cooperation. The presumption was sickening. "Stay hidden," he whispered to the sisters, then stepped outside onto the porch. Morrison looked older, but no less dangerous. His hair had gone gray at the temples and new scars marked his weathered face. But his eyes held the same cold calculation that had terrified Gideon 15 years ago. "Well, well," Morrison said, dismounting from his horse. "You've done well for yourself out here. Nice, quiet place to lay low. What do you want, Dutch?" "What I want is my old partner back. I've got a job that needs doing, and I need someone I can trust." Morrison's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Someone who knows how to keep his mouth shut. I'm not your partner. I never was. Now, that's not how I remember it." Morrison stepped closer, his hand resting casually on his gun. "But I remember you taking my money real eager. I remember you disappearing that very night without a word to nobody. That's partnership behavior, Gideon." "That was fear, not partnership. Call it what you want. Point is, you've been living free all these years because of our arrangement. Time to pay some of that debt back." Through the window, Gideon caught a glimpse of movement. The sisters were positioning themselves, preparing for whatever came next. His heart raced as he realized the explosive situation building around him. "What kind of job?" he asked, stalling. "Supply wagon heading through Devil's Canyon next week. Army payroll. Enough silver to set us all up for life. But it's a tricky job, needs careful planning, needs someone the soldiers might trust." Morrison's eyes glittered with greed. "Someone with a respectable reputation, and if I refuse," Morrison's expression darkened. "You know too much about my business to refuse, partner. Always have. That's why I kept track of you all these years. Insurance, you might call it." The threat was clear. Cooperate or die. But before Gideon could respond, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Dutch Morrison." All three men spun toward the cabin. Ayanna stood in the doorway, her rifle trained on Morrison's chest. Behind her, Ka emerged with a pistol in each hand. Morrison's face went white as he recognized them. "No," he breathed, "it can't be." "Hello, Uncle," Ayanna said, her voice steady as stone. "We've been looking for you." The recognition in Morrison's eyes confirmed what Gideon had just learned. These weren't just Dakota's sisters. They were Morrison's nieces. The man had murdered his own family. "You killed our brother," Kaya said, her voice trembling with 15 years of suppressed rage. "Your own nephew." "Dakota was getting too bold," Morrison replied, his shock giving way to defensive anger, always stirring up trouble with the other tribes, making it harder for everyone to do business. "He would have gotten us all killed. He was trying to protect our people from thieves like you. I was trying to survive." Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, but stopped when he saw both sisters tighten their grips on their weapons. "You think I wanted it to happen? He was family. Family doesn't steal from family," Ayanna said coldly. "Family doesn't murder family for profit." Morrison's men were reaching for their weapons when Gideon made his choice. After 15 years of cowardice of running from the truth, he finally found his courage. "Dutch Morrison murdered Dakota in cold blood," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the yard. "The boy never drew his weapon, never threatened anyone. Morrison shot him down like a dog and paid me to keep quiet about it." "Shut your mouth, Flint. I watched him die," Gideon continued, stepping between Morrison and the sisters. I watched you kill an unarmed boy, and I said nothing, but I'm saying something now." Morrison's face twisted with rage. "You broke our deal. There was never any deal. There was just a coward too afraid to speak the truth." Morrison went for his gun, but Gideon was ready. He tackled the older man around the waist, driving him backward into the dirt. They rolled and struggled, fighting for control of Morrison's weapon. The two gunmen tried to help their boss, but found themselves facing the sisters' steady aim. Smart enough to recognize a losing position, they raised their hands in surrender. Morrison broke free and scrambled to his feet, his gun finally clear of its holster. But as he raised it toward Gideon, Ayanna's rifle spoke first. The shot echoed across the prairie, and Dutch Morrison crumpled to the ground. He tried to speak, blood frothing from his lips, but only managed a wet gurgle before his eyes went dark. For a long moment, the four survivors stood in the sudden quiet, staring down at the body of the man who had poisoned so many lives. "It's finished," Kaya said softly. Gideon looked at the sisters, these remarkable women who had tracked him down not for revenge, but for justice. "What happens now?" "Now you live with the truth instead of running from it," Ayanna replied, "and maybe that's enough." They buried Morrison in an unmarked grave behind the cabin. His men rode away, eager to distance themselves from their dead leader's crimes. And as the sun set over the prairie, Gideon finally felt the weight of 15 years lifting from his shoulders. The sisters stayed 3 more days helping him set his affairs in order. When they finally left, Gideon gave them Morrison's remaining money. Blood money that would help rebuild what the killer had destroyed. He never saw them again, but he never forgot them either. And for the first time in 15 years, Gideon Flint slept peacefully through the night. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale where courage and redemption collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.